The morning fog rolled in thick across the small town of Pine Grove, wrapping around street lamps and storefront signs like a winter blanket. It was barely 7 a.m., and Officer Mike Chen was just starting his shift, warming his hands with a cup of coffee from the local diner. 20 years on the force had taught him that no 2 days were ever the same, but nothing could have prepared him for what this December morning would bring. The call came in through his radio. A beat-up pickup truck parked in the fire lane outside Wilson's grocery. Simple enough, he thought, probably someone rushing in for milk or bread, thinking they'd be quick. But as he pulled into the parking lot, something about this scene felt different. The old Ford F-150 had definitely seen better days. Paint peeling off the sides, a small dent in the rear bumper, but what caught Officer Chen's attention were the military stickers on the back window. He'd seen plenty of those before. His own brother had served, but these were faded, weathered, like they'd been there through years of sun and storm. Hazard lights blinked rhythmically, cutting through the morning mist. As Chen stepped out of his patrol car, he noticed a man struggling with several bags of groceries. The guy was maybe in his mid-30s, wearing a worn military jacket that had probably been green once but now held that grayish tint that comes with too many washes. What struck Chen wasn't the jacket, though. It was how the man moved, like every step required intense concentration. "Morning, sir," Chen called out, keeping his voice casual but clear. No response. The man continued wrestling with his bags, his movements becoming more jerky, more uncertain. A box of cereal tumbled from one of the overstuffed bags, hitting the wet pavement with a soft thud. Chen took a few steps closer, protocol kicking in. "Sir, I need you to acknowledge me." Still nothing. Just more rigid movements, like someone trying to complete a task while underwater. By now, early morning shoppers were starting to notice the scene unfolding. An elderly woman paused with her cart, watching. A young dad held his daughter's hand a little tighter as they walked past. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Chen had handled thousands of routine stops, but something about this one made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Not because he felt threatened, no, this was different. Years of experience had taught him to read people, and everything about this man's body language screamed that he was somewhere else entirely. Chen noticed more details now. The man's boots, standard military issue, worn but meticulously cleaned and laced. His hands, trembling slightly but covered in calluses that spoke of years of hard work. A chain disappeared beneath his collar, probably holding dog tags hidden from view. Just as Chen prepared to move closer, a car in the nearby street backfired with a sharp crack. The man's reaction was instant and heartbreaking. He dropped to a crouch, groceries scattering across the wet pavement, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. In that moment, Officer Chen realized this wasn't just another traffic stop. This was a fellow human being fighting battles most people couldn't see. Time seemed to slow down. The foggy parking lot of Wilson's grocery faded away, and Chen found himself remembering late-night phone calls with his brother after he'd returned from overseas. The nightmares, the struggles with everyday noise, the way certain sounds could transport him back to places he'd rather forget. A gallon of milk rolled slowly across the pavement, stopping against Chen's boot. Oranges from a torn bag made a bright trail in the gray morning light. But Chen wasn't looking at the spilled groceries anymore. He was watching the man's face, seeing the distant look in his eyes slowly fade back to awareness, like someone swimming up from deep water. This wasn't going to be a story about tickets or violations. This was going to be a story about understanding, about those moments when duty meets humanity. And as Officer Chen took a careful step forward, he knew this cold December morning was about to teach both of them something important about compassion, service, and the battles some people fight long after leaving the battlefield. Officer Chen took another careful step forward, his boots making soft splashing sounds in the puddles left by the morning's drizzle. The scattered groceries created an obstacle course between him and the veteran, who was still crouched near his truck, muscles tense like a coiled spring. Every instinct from Chen's police training told him to take control of the situation, but something deeper, maybe the memory of his brother's struggles, make him pause. "Hey there," Chen tried again, keeping his voice steady and calm, like talking to a spooked horse. "I just want to make sure you're okay." The words hum in the misty air between them. A few more early morning shoppers had stopped to watch, their breath visible in the cold December air. Chen wished they wouldn't stare. This wasn't a show. This was somebody's real life unfolding in front of them. The veteran's head snapped up at the sound of Chen's voice, but his eyes were seeing something else, something far away from this grocery store parking lot. His hands were pressed flat against the wet pavement, and Chen noticed they were scarred, the kind of scars that told stories of sacrifice and service. "Sir, I need you to stand up slowly," Chen said, using his official voice now, though it pained him to do so. Protocol was protocol, and a growing crowd meant he needed to gain control of the situation, but the veteran didn't move. Instead, his breathing became more rapid, his chest rising and falling like he'd just run a marathon. A teenager's car stereo suddenly boomed from somewhere in the parking lot, the bass thundering through the morning quiet. The veteran's reaction was immediate. He pressed himself against the truck's wheel well, hands moving instinctively to his hip where a weapon might have been during his service days. Chen's own hand moved toward his belt, training kicking in, but he forced it back to his side. This wasn't a threat. This was a man trapped in memories that most people couldn't imagine. I can't. The veteran muttered, his first words since Chen arrived. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. The sound, they're coming. His eyes darted around, seeing threats that existed only in his mind. Chen made a decision then, one that went against everything in the police manual. He slowly knelt down, putting himself at eye level with the veteran, deliberately making himself vulnerable. "I'm going to sit right here with you," he said softly, "and we're going to wait until those sounds make sense again." The morning air was cold enough to make their breath visible, creating little clouds that disappeared into the fog. Chen could hear the whispers of onlookers, the shuffle of feet, the distant sound of cars on the main road. But he kept his eyes on the veteran, watching as awareness slowly crept back into his face. An elderly man stepped forward from the small crowd, his own veteran's cap sitting proudly on his head. Without a word, he began picking up the scattered groceries, placing them carefully back in their bags. Others joined him, a young mother, a teenager in a Letterman jacket, a store employee on his way to work. They moved quietly, respectfully, like they were in church. The veteran's eyes focused on this simple act of kindness, and Chen could see something shift in his expression. The 1,000-yard stare began to fade, replaced by something closer to confusion than embarrassment. His breathing slowed, his shoulders relaxed slightly. I'm sorry," the veteran whispered, looking at the ground. "Sometimes the sounds." "Don't apologize," Chen said firmly. "Not for this, never for this." He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Not his official police card, but one for the local veterans support group his brother had helped start. "My brother, he came back from overseas a few years ago. Some days are harder than others for him too." The veteran's eyes met Chen's for the first time, really saw him. There was recognition there now, not of Chen personally, but of someone who might understand. The morning fog was starting to lift, and with it, the heavy atmosphere that had enveloped their corner of the parking lot. A box of cereal still lay on its side nearby, slightly damp from the pavement. The veteran reached for it with a steadier hand, and Chen noticed a faded medical alert bracelet on his wrist. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that made Chen's heart ache. This wasn't just about a parking violation anymore. This was about something much bigger, much more important than any traffic law. The morning sun was finally breaking through the fog, casting long shadows across the grocery store parking lot. Officer Chen watched as the veteran slowly got to his feet, his movements more controlled now, but still careful, like someone walking on ice. The small crowd of helpful strangers had finished gathering the scattered groceries, placing the bags neatly by the truck's tailgate. Something caught Chen's eye, a familiar emblem on the veteran's boots. Not just any military boots, but the same model his brother wore during his service. They were worn but impeccably maintained, the leather carefully treated despite the scuffs and scratches that told stories of hard miles. These weren't the boots of someone who had let go of their military discipline. These were the boots of someone who held onto it like a lifeline. "Those are Marine Corps boots," Chen said softly, not as a question but as a connection. The veteran's eyes flickered down to his feet, then back to Chen's face. A supple shift happened in his posture, shoulders squaring slightly, chin lifting just a fraction. Muscle memory from years of service coming back in that small moment of recognition. 3rd Battalion, the veteran replied, his voice steadier now. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the morning light revealing stress lines around his eyes that made him look older than he probably was. 8 years. Got out at 19. Chen nodded, noting how the veteran's hand drifted to his chest, where dog tags likely hung under his shirt. It was a gesture Chen had seen his brother make countless times, an unconscious checking of something that had been part of his identity for so long. I noticed you've got quite a load of groceries here, Chen said, gesturing to the bags. The veteran's eyes darted to the food, and something like pride mixed with embarrassment crossed his face. The elderly veteran who had helped gather the groceries stepped forward, his own military cap still sitting proudly on his white hair. Son, the older veteran said, I saw the flyers in the store. You're the one organizing the food drive for the veterans' shelter, aren't you? His voice carried the weight of understanding that only comes from shared experience. The younger veteran nodded, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. Started it last year, he said. After my buddy. He stopped, swallowed hard. After we lost someone. Seemed like the right thing to do. Ken felt something in his chest tighten. He'd seen the flyers too, posted all over town, veterans helping veterans, holiday food drive. He just hadn't made the connection until now. The beat-up truck, the overloaded grocery bags, the early morning shopping trip, it all made sense. A young store employee who had been helping with the groceries spoke up. My uncle was in the Marines, she said, her voice soft but clear. He had days like this too. The loud noises, the flashbacks. She twisted her apron in her hands. He found help eventually. It got better. The veteran looked at her, really looked at her, and Chen saw something change in his expression. It was like watching a wall crack, not crumble completely, but enough to let some light through. The man's hands had stopped shaking entirely now, and his breathing had found a normal rhythm. It's not always like this, the veteran said, almost apologetically. Most days I'm fine. It's just sometimes. He gestured vaguely at the sky, the parking lot, the world. Sometimes it all becomes too much. The sounds, the memories. Chen picked up the last bag of groceries, placing it carefully in the truck bed. You know, he said, my brother told me something once. He said the hardest part wasn't what happened over there. The hardest part was feeling alone when he came back here. The veteran's eyes met Chen's, and there was a moment of perfect understanding between them. Not just between a cop and a civilian, or even between a veteran's brother and a veteran, but between two human beings who knew what it meant to carry weight that others couldn't see. The sun was fully up now, turning the remaining puddles into mirrors that reflected the morning light. The small crowd had begun to disperse, each person leaving with a new understanding of what strength really looked like. It didn't look like the movies. It looked like a man fighting invisible battles while still trying to help others. It looked like getting up every morning and choosing to make the world a little better, even when the world felt too loud, too bright, too much. Officer Chen leaned against his patrol car, his coffee long forgotten and cold. The veteran had agreed to talk, and they'd moved away from the curious eyes of shoppers to a quieter corner of the parking lot. The morning sun cast long shadows behind them as the veteran began to share his story. I was a staff sergeant, he said, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the hood of his truck. 3 tours in Afghanistan. You see a lot in 8 years. Some things you want to remember, some things you'd give anything to forget. He paused, collecting his thoughts. But it's the stuff you can't forget that haunts you the most. The veteran's eyes focused on something distant, beyond the parking lot, beyond the small town. My unit, we were like family. You hear that a lot, but it's true. When you spend every day together, eat together, face death together, those bonds become stronger than blood. Chen noticed how the veteran's hand unconsciously moved to his left shoulder, where a slight bulge under his jacket suggested a healed injury. We were on patrol in Kandahar province, he continued. Nothing special about that day, nothing that should have made it different from any other. The sun was just coming up, kind of like now. He stopped, taking a deep breath. Chen didn't push, didn't prompt. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. After a moment, the veteran continued. The ambush came out of nowhere. 1 minute we're checking a routine checkpoint, the next, his voice trailed off. The sound of gunfire, the explosions, they become part of you, like your heartbeat. But this was different. This time, we had civilians caught in the crossfire. The veteran's hands gripped the edge of his truck, knuckles white. My team, we did what we had to do. Got the civilians to safety first. That's the job, that's what we signed up for. But my best friend, his voice caught. He was covering our retreat, last man out, always looking after everyone else. That's just who he was. Chen watched as the veteran pulled out his wallet, carefully removing a folded photograph. The edges were worn smooth from years of handling. In it, 2 young Marines stood arm in arm, desert sand and mountains behind them, both grinning despite the harsh conditions. "That's Pete," the veteran said softly. "Best man I ever knew. Saved 4 of our guys that day, got the civilians clear. But he..." The veteran carefully folded the photo, returning it to his wallet. "They gave me a silver star for what happened next. Fancy piece of metal that's supposed to make up for everything we lost that day." But all I could think about was Pete's family back home, his little girl who'd never see her dad again. He gestured to the groceries in his truck. "This food drive, it started because of Pete. He was always talking about doing something to help other vets when we got home. Had all these plans. So when I got back, it seemed right to make at least one of his plans happen." A young boy rode past on his bicycle, the playing card in his spokes making a clicking sound. The veteran flinched slightly but kept his composure. "The PTSD, it's not just about the memories. It's about feeling like you left part of yourself over there. Some days are better than others. Most times I can handle the noise, the crowds. But sometimes..." "Like today," Chen offered quietly. The veteran nodded. "Like today. That car backfiring. Suddenly, I wasn't here anymore. I was back there, in that moment, hearing those same sounds, feeling that same fear." He straightened up, squaring his shoulders. "But I keep going. We all do. Because that's what Pate would have done." He reached into the truck's cab, pulling out a flyer for the food drive. The paper was crisp and new, unlike the one photograph. "Last year, we helped 35 veteran families through the winter. This year, we're aiming for 50. It's not much, but..." "It's everything," Chen finished for him. "To those families, it's everything." The veteran looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded. Pete used to say that the real test of a soldier isn't what they do in combat, but what they do when they come home. How they keep serving, keep helping others, even when the uniform comes off. The morning had grown warmer, the last of the fog burning away. Around them, the town was waking up fully, people going about their daily routines, unaware of the story being shared in this quiet corner of a grocery store parking lot. But something had changed, not just for the veteran and Officer Chen, but for the small group of people who had witnessed this morning's events. As the veteran's story settled in the morning air, Officer Chen felt the weight of his badge differently. What had started as a routine call about an illegally parked vehicle had transformed into something much more meaningful. The parking violation ticket book in his pocket seemed almost ridiculous now, like trying to measure an ocean with a teaspoon. "You know," Chen said, breaking the thoughtful silence, "I've been on the force for 15 years, but some days still surprise me." He pulled out his phone, showing the veteran a photo of his own brother in uniform. "My brother served too. Army. Different branch, same struggles." The veteran studied the photo, recognition flickering in his eyes. "The way they stand," he said softly. "You can always tell a service member by the way they stand." He was right. Chen's brother in the photo had that same military bearing, that same invisible steel in his spine. A delivery truck rumbled past, and both men instinctively tracked the sound. The veteran's reaction was smaller this time, more controlled. It was like watching someone navigate familiar rough waters, still difficult, but with the knowledge of how to handle the waves. "The Silver Star," Chen said carefully, "that must have been one hell of a day." He wasn't asking for war stories or glory tales. This was about understanding, about acknowledging the cost of that medal. The veteran's eyes grew distant again, but differently this time. "The medal's in a drawer somewhere," he said. "Can't even look at it most days. Feels wrong to have it when..." He trailed off, then found his voice again. "When better men didn't come home." Chen watched as the veteran absently straightened one of the grocery bags in his truck bed. Everything about him spoke of continued service, the carefully maintained appearance despite obvious financial constraints, the dedication to helping other veterans, the way he carried himself even in the midst of a PTSD episode. "Some guys I know," the veteran continued, Organizing cans of food with military precision, they came back and couldn't handle the quiet. Weird, right? After all the noise over there, you'd think quiet would be welcome. But sometimes the quiet's worse. Gives your mind too much space to remember. A young mother walked by with her toddler, who was wearing tiny camo print boots. The veteran's face softened at the sight. Pete's daughter has boots like that, he said. She wears them to visit his grave. Says she wants to walk in her daddy's footsteps. Chen felt his throat tighten. He thought about his own brother, about the nights he'd gotten those desperate phone calls, about the way his brother's children tiptoed around him on his bad days. The understanding between them deepened, not through words, but through shared experience and empathy. The food drive, Chen said, gesturing to the loaded truck bed, it's more than just groceries, isn't it? The veteran nodded, a hint of pride breaking through his serious expression. It's about connection. Some of these vets, they won't ask for help. Too proud, too scared, too used to being the ones doing the helping. But food? That's different. Breaking bread together, that's as old as warfare itself. He pulled out another flyer, this one crumpled from being in his pocket. We don't just drop off the food. We sit with them, share a meal sometimes. Talk about nothing, talk about everything. Some of these guys haven't told their stories to anyone else. Something about being with another vet, it makes it easier. The morning had grown warmer, and more shoppers were filling the parking lot. But in their quiet corner, time seemed to move differently. Chen thought about all the times he'd responded to calls involving veterans. How many times had he misread the situation? How many times had he seen defiance when he should have seen pain? My brother, Chen said, choosing his words carefully, he found help through a support group. Took him 3 years to walk through that door, but when he did, he paused, remembering the gradual return of his brother's smile, the slow easing of the tension in his shoulders. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't what we do in the moment of crisis. It's what we do in the quiet after. The veteran looked at him, understanding flowing between them like an invisible current. Here they were, two men from different worlds, finding common ground in the shared experience of loving someone who carried the invisible wounds of war. The morning sun had risen fully now, warming the air and casting shorter shadows across the parking lot. Officer Chen found himself doing something he'd never done before during a traffic stop. He was helping load groceries into the back of the truck he'd originally come to ticket. My brother would get a kick out of this, Chen said, carefully arranging a box of cereal next to some canned goods. A cop and a Marine organizing groceries together. Sounds like the beginning of a joke he'd tell. The veteran cracked a small smile, the first real one Chen had seen all morning. The Marines and the Army might argue about everything else, but we all agree on one thing: food brings people together. He adjusted a bag of apples so it wouldn't bruise. That's why this food drive means so much. It's not charity, it's community. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery next door. The veteran paused, taking a deep breath. You know, when I first got back, I couldn't even walk into a grocery store. Too many people, too many sounds, too many choices. Went from making life or death decisions to standing in the cereal aisle for an hour, completely overwhelmed. Ken nodded, understanding flowing between them. My brother was the same way. Said the hardest part wasn't the big things, it was the small stuff. Like how to answer when someone asked, "How are you?" When you're not fine but can't explain why. The veteran leaned against his truck, his posture more relaxed now. First time I tried to organize this food drive, I nearly gave up. Paperwork, permits, coordinating with the stores, felt harder than any mission I'd run overseas. But then I remembered something Pete used to say. The mission's not over just because we came home. An elderly couple walked past, pushing their shopping cart. The woman smiled warmly at them, and her husband, wearing a Korean War veteran's cap, gave a respectful nod. The veteran returned the nod, that unspoken understanding passing between generations of service members. You know what's funny? The veteran said, watching the elderly couple walk away. When I was over there, all I could think about was getting home. Now that I'm home, sometimes I feel like I left part of myself over there. But then I do something like this. He gestured to the truck full of groceries, and I find pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. Chen pulled out his phone again, but this time he opened his contacts. Listen, there's this group my brother goes to. Not therapy exactly. Just veterans getting together, talking about whatever comes up. They meet at the coffee shop on Pine Street every Thursday morning. The veteran tensed slightly. Chen could see the internal struggle playing across his face. The fear of opening up warring with the need for connection. No pressure, Chen added quickly. But they do good work. Help with VA paperwork, job searches, sometimes just provide a quiet place to sit when the world gets too loud. My brother says it saved his life, though he'll only admit that after his third cup of coffee. A young boy dropped his toy car nearby, the plastic making a sharp clatter against the pavement. Both men flinched at the sudden noise, then shared a knowing look. The veteran's reaction was calmer this time, progress measured in small victories. You know what the hardest part of coming home was? The veteran asked, helping the boy pick up his toy. Everyone expected me to be exactly the same person who left, but you can't see what we saw, do what we did, and not be changed. The trick is figuring out how to be different without being broken. Ken thought about his brother saying almost the same words. Maybe that's why community matters so much, he said. People who understand the changes because they've been through them too. The veteran reached into his wallet and pulled out one of his food drive flyers, handling it like it was as valuable as his military medals. Would he maybe want to help with the next delivery? We could always use more hands, especially someone who understands. Chen felt something shift in the air between them, the official barriers of cop and civilian, the invisible walls that people build around their pain, all starting to come down. He'd like that, Chen said. We both would. They finished loading the last of the groceries, each movement now comfortable and coordinated, like they'd been working together for years instead of hours. The morning traffic was picking up, but in their corner of the parking lot, they'd found a pocket of understanding that made the noise fade into the background. 6 months had passed since that foggy morning in the grocery store parking lot. Officer Chen stood at the back of a crowded community center, watching as the veteran addressed a room full of police officers, all of them listening intently to every word. We're trained to see threats, the veteran was saying, his voice steady and clear. Both of us, military and police, but sometimes the biggest threats aren't what they seem. Sometimes they're the invisible battles being fought right in front of us. The room was quiet except for the occasional scratch of pens on notepads. Chen noticed how different the veteran looked now, still carrying the weight of his experiences, but standing taller, speaking with purpose. The food drive had grown into something bigger than anyone had expected. That morning could have gone very differently, the veteran continued, gesturing to Chen at the back of the room. One police officer chose to look beyond the surface, to see the person behind the crisis. That's why I'm standing here today, why we're all here, learning to bridge the gap between those who serve in uniform and those who served overseas. Ken thought back to how much had changed. His department had implemented new training programs, teaching officers how to recognize and respond to veterans in crisis. His brother had become a regular volunteer at the food drive, finding healing in helping others who understood his struggles. The veteran clicked to the next slide in his presentation, a photo of his old unit. When we come home, we bring the war with us. Not in our bags or our boots, but in our minds, our hearts. The sounds of home. A car backfiring, fireworks, even a door slamming, they can take us right back there in an instant. A young officer raised her hand. How can we help? What should we look for? The veteran smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes. Look for the signs we might miss. The military bearing that never quite goes away, the scanning of rooms for exits, the flinch at sudden noises. But most importantly, look for the person behind those signs. We're not broken, we're adapting to living in two worlds at once. Chen watched as his fellow officers took notes, asked questions, shared their own stories of encounters with veterans. The wall between police and veterans was coming down, one story at a time. After the presentation, the veteran pulled out his phone, showing Chen a photo from the latest food drive. The small operation had grown to serve over 200 veteran families. Local businesses had gotten involved, offering jobs, resources, and support. But more importantly, they'd created a network of understanding. You know what Pate would say about all this? The veteran said, his voice thick with emotion. He'd say we finally got it right. We're still serving, just in a different way now. Chen nodded, remembering his own brother's transformation. He'd be proud. They all would be. The veteran tucked away his phone, but not before Chen caught a glimpse of another photo, the veteran and Chen's brother, surrounded by volunteers at the last food drive, all of them smiling, all of them healing together. The funny thing is, the veteran said, gathering his presentation materials that morning, when everything was spinning out of control, I thought I'd hit rock bottom. Turns out it wasn't the bottom at all. It was the foundation for something bigger than myself. Outside the community center, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Police officers and veterans mingled in the parking lot, sharing stories, exchanging contact information, building bridges between their worlds. A young rookie officer approached them, her eyes bright with purpose. "Sir," she said to the veteran, "your story. It changed how I'll approach every traffic stop from now on. Thank you for helping us understand." The veteran looked at Chen, then back at the rookie. "Thank your fellow officer here. He showed me that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. We just have to be willing to look past what we think we see to what's really there." As they walked to their cars, Chen noticed how the veteran no longer scanned the parking lot for threats. His movements were easier, more relaxed. The invisible weight he carried seemed lighter somehow. "You know," the veteran said, pausing by his truck, the same one from that foggy morning, now sporting a fresh coat of paint and new tires, "someone once told me that the bravest thing isn't what we do in the moment of crisis. It's what we do in the quiet after." Chen smiled, recognizing his own words from months ago. "Looks like we both learned something that morning." The veteran nodded, starting his engine. "We sure did. And now, thanks to that parking violation that never was, hundreds of others are learning too." As Chen watched the veteran drive away, he thought about how one moment of understanding had created ripples that were still spreading through their community. Sometimes the biggest transformations start with the smallest choices, like choosing to see the person behind the crisis, choosing to listen instead of act, choosing to understand instead of judge. The badge on his chest caught the last rays of sunlight, reminding him of its weight, its responsibility, and now, its potential to bridge gaps he never knew existed. "You know," the veteran said, pausing by his truck, the same one from that foggy morning, now sporting a fresh coat of paint and new tires, "someone once told me that the bravest thing isn't what we do in the moment of crisis. It's what we do in a quiet after." Chen smiled, recognizing his own words from months ago. "Looks like we both learned something that morning." The veteran nodded, starting his engine. "We sure did. And now, thanks to that parking violation that never was, hundreds of others are learning too." As Chen watched the veteran drive away, he thought about how one moment of understanding had created ripples that were still spreading through their community. Sometimes the biggest transformations start with the smallest choices, like choosing to see the person behind the crisis, choosing to listen instead of act, choosing to understand instead of judge. The badge on his chest caught the last rays of sunlight, reminding him of its weight, its responsibility, and now, its potential to bridge gaps he never knew existed.